A recipe for trouble. Two rivals. One kitchen. A recipe for romance and disaster. By Win Valentine. First edition published by I2I Hype, LLC 2025. Copyright 2025 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities, is entirely coincidental. Win Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco.
Chapter 1: The Rival Returns. Josie Lin was having the dream again. The one where she stood on the baking competition stage, holding the gleaming golden whisk trophy overhead while confetti rained down. Only this time there was music. Her brow furrowed as the sound filtered through her subconscious. A familiar melody, lilting in French, hummed in a rich tenor that she hadn't heard in years. Her eyes snapped open. The worn cookbook she'd fallen asleep reading slid off her chest, dusting her comforter with a fine shower of flour. That wasn't a dream. That was real. And it was coming through her wall. "No," Josie whispered, sitting bolt upright. "No, no, no." The humming continued, an old French lullaby she recognized from childhood visits to the Marchand household. The same tune Gigi used to hum while teaching them to fold paper-thin crepe batter. The same tune Theo would absently hum while they did homework together as teenagers. That was Theo Marchand's voice coming through her wall. "Absolutely not," she said to her empty bedroom as realization crashed over her. Her new neighbor, the one she'd been too busy to properly investigate after hearing they'd moved in yesterday, was Theo "Stupid" Marchand. The humming shifted into whistling, somehow even more cheerful and infuriatingly melodic. Josie grabbed her pillow and smashed it against the wall with a satisfying thud. The whistling stopped abruptly. Vindication lasted approximately 3 seconds before it resumed, louder, more elaborate, with unnecessarily fancy trills that practically screamed, "I spent years in a fancy French culinary school and abandoned all my childhood friends." "Unbelievable," Josie muttered, throwing back her covers and stomping to her tiny kitchenette. She grabbed her coffee beans and slammed them into the grinder, hitting the button with far more force than necessary. The grinding noise temporarily drowned out the whistling, but not the complicated feelings rising in her chest. She hadn't seen Theo in person for months, not since he'd opened Marchand's patisserie on the opposite side of town and started stealing her customers with his fancy French tarts and stupidly perfect croissants. The last real conversation they'd had was at last year's Maplewood bake-off, where his dark chocolate soufflé had beaten her black sesame cream puffs by half a point. Half a point. The coffee grinder sputtered to a stop. The whistling continued. Josie grabbed her robe, cinching it with violent efficiency as she paced her apartment. "Insufferable French pastry boy," she muttered, measuring coffee grounds. "Thinks he can just move in next door and infiltrate my life with his stupid perfect whistling and his stupid perfect hair and his stupid perfect pastries." She banged cabinet doors as she searched for her favorite mug, the one with "Bakers do it with better buns" printed on it, a gift from Eli. It wasn't helping her mood that everything in her kitchen was covered in a fine layer of flour from her late-night recipe testing. The water boiled. The whistling shifted into humming again. Josie considered filing a noise complaint before realizing it was 6:30 a.m., a perfectly reasonable time to be awake and making noise. especially for bakers. With her coffee clutched in her hands like a lifeline, she shuffled to the bathroom. Midway through brushing her teeth, she heard Theo's voice again, this time speaking rapid French. He was on the phone, his voice rising and falling in that particular way that made ordinary French sound like poetry. Oui, grand-mère, she heard clearly through the thin wall. Then to her horror, her own name, Josie Lin. Josie froze, toothbrush hanging from her mouth. She leaned closer to the wall, mint foam threatening to drip onto her pajamas. Concours de pâtisserie, came Theo's voice. Something about the baking competition? Her French was rusty, but she recognized that phrase. Then, partenaires. Partners? What partners? She pressed her ear directly against the cool tile, straining to hear more. Her elbow knocked against her precariously balanced shower caddy, sending bottles of shampoo, conditioner, and her special occasion hair mask clattering into the bathtub with a spectacular crash. Silence from next door. Qu'est-ce que c'était? She heard Theo ask, presumably into the phone. Josie hastily rinsed her mouth and grabbed a towel to mop up the spilled hair products, her face burning with embarrassment. Perfect. Now he knew she was eavesdropping. But why was he talking about her to his grandmother? And what was this about partners? 20 minutes later, Josie was dressed in her favorite floral blouse and jeans, hair twisted into a messy bun secured with 2 pencils. She'd spent extra time on her makeup, not because Theo might see her, she told herself firmly, but because looking professional was important for a business owner. She grabbed her tote bag and practically ran out her door, locking it behind her with trembling fingers. If she hurried, she could avoid. Morning, neighbor? Him. Josie squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, then turned with what she hoped was a neutral expression. But Theo wasn't there. Just his voice from around the corner, still on the phone. Relief flooded her system as she scurried toward the stairs. That's when she saw them, a stack of moving boxes outside his apartment, each labeled in neat black marker. Kitchen equipment, bakeware, specialty tools, and her eyes narrowed, competition supplies. Curiosity overrode her better judgment. She slowed, peering at the boxes. One was partially open, revealing the gleaming stainless steel arm of what was undoubtedly a top-of-the-line KitchenAid stand mixer. The Pro 7-quart model. In copper. With all the attachments. Her own mixer, a dependable but basic model she'd saved up for years to buy, suddenly seemed inadequate. See something you like? Came Theo's voice, much closer this time. Josie jumped backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. I was just... But once again, the hallway was empty. His voice was coming from inside his apartment, still speaking French. Feeling foolish, Josie hurried down the stairs and out into the crisp morning air. She'd worry about the Theo situation later. Right now, she had a bakery to open. Sweet Haven Bakery was Josie's pride and joy, a warm, inviting space with exposed brick walls, wooden tables, and display cases filled with her handcrafted pastries. She'd built it from nothing, maxing out credit cards and working 16-hour days until her little bakery became one of Maplewood's beloved institutions. Usually, arriving at Sweet Haven filled Josie with calm purpose. Today, as she approached the storefront and saw the lights already on inside, anxiety crawled up her spine. Through the window, she could make out 2 elderly women sitting at the corner table, one small and wiry with silver-streaked black hair, the other tall and elegant with a perfectly coiffed white bob. They were leaning toward each other, heads close in conspiratorial conversation, teacups steaming between them. Po May and Genevieve Gigi Marchand. The moment Josie pushed through the door, they fell suspiciously silent. The little bell above the entrance might as well have chimed doom, instead of its usual cheerful tinkle. Ah, there she is. Po May exclaimed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Jiao, you're early today. Josie's eyes narrowed at the use of her childhood nickname. Po only used it when she was up to something. So are you, Josie replied, setting her bag on the counter. Both of you. In my locked bakery. Before opening hours. Eli let us in, Gigi said, her French accent still pronounced even after decades in Maplewood. She sipped her tea delicately. He had to step out for more eggs. How convenient, Josie muttered, hanging up her jacket and grabbing her favorite apron, the one with tiny whisks printed all over it. And what brings the two of you here at, she checked her watch, 6:58 a.m. Can't a grandmother visit her favorite granddaughter? Po asked innocently. I'm your only granddaughter, Josie pointed out, tying her apron with quick, efficient movements. And such a lovely one, Gigi added. Have you seen your new neighbor yet? Josie's hands froze on her apron strings. She looked up slowly, taking in the too casual way Gigi examined her perfectly manicured nails, and the barely suppressed smile on Po's face. The new neighbor, Josie repeated flatly. In the apartment next to mine. That new neighbor? Yes, dear, Po said, pouring more tea from a small ceramic teapot. I believe you know him. Theo just moved back from the other side of town. Such a shame about his old apartment's plumbing issues. Plumbing issues. Right. The same plumbing issues that mysteriously appeared right after Po's mahjong group met with the building's superintendent last week. What a fortunate coincidence, Josie said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she began pulling ingredients for the morning's first batch of pastries. Theo just happens to move into the apartment next to mine. The only available apartment in the building. The world works in mysterious ways, Gigi said, exchanging a glance with Po. Josie grabbed her largest mixing bowl with more force than necessary, and began measuring flour for the day's first batch of brioche. She needed to channel her frustration into something productive, before she said something she'd regret. As she aggressively kneaded the dough, folding and pressing with rhythmic precision, Po casually mentioned, Have you heard about this year's Maplewood bake-off? Josie grunted, focused on the dough between her hands. There are some exciting new rules this year, Po continued, her voice light and airy in a way that immediately set off warning bells in Josie's head. The committee has been working on it for months, Gigi added, her French accent somehow more pronounced. We think it will really, how do you say, shake things up? What committee? Josie asked, looking up from her dough. What are you talking about? The bake-off committee, of course, Po said as if it were obvious. Gigi and I are co-chairs this year. The dough squished between Josie's fingers as her hands involuntarily clenched. Since when? Oh, since old Mrs. Finkelstein had that unfortunate incident with the butter sculpture, Gigi said with a dismissive wave. The teams will be pre-selected by the committee this year. Teams? Josie echoed, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. What teams? The bell above the door chimed, cutting off any response. Josie looked up, already knowing who she'd see. Theo Marchand strolled in like he owned the place, all 6'1" of him radiating effortless confidence. His dark hair was artfully tousled as if he'd just run his hands through it, which she knew he did when he was nervous, not that she still remembered all his tells or anything. He wore a simple white t-shirt under an open button-down, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that had clearly been shaped by years of kneading dough. Bonjour, grandmère, he said, crossing to Gigi and pressing a kiss to each of her cheeks. Then he turned to Po May and did the same. Po, you look beautiful as always. Flatterer, Po said, patting his cheek affectionately. Just like your grandfather. Josie remained frozen at her workstation, hands covered in dough, heart hammering in her chest. Theo's gaze finally slid to her, and the corner of his mouth quirked up in that infuriating half-smile. Morning, neighbor, he said, and Josie realized that had been him in the hallway after all. He'd seen her snooping at his boxes. The embarrassment made her cheeks flush. Theo, she managed with a curt nod. What are you doing here? I was invited, he said, pulling a chair from another table and joining the grandmothers. Family meeting of sorts. About the bake-off, Gigi added, her eyes twinkling with barely concealed delight. We were just explaining the new team format to Josie. Josie's gaze snapped between the three of them, realization dawning with horrible clarity.
No, she said, shaking her head.
Absolutely not. The decision is final, Po said firmly. This year's Maplewood Bake-Off will feature pairs of bakers with complementary skills, selected by the committee to push competitors outside their comfort zones. And our first official team pairing, Gigi announced, gesturing between Theo and Josie with a flourish, is Josie Lin and Theo Marchand. The dough in Josie's hands might as well have been her heart, the way it seemed to stop mid-beat. She stared at her grandmother, then at Gigi, then finally at Theo. His expression was inscrutable, but was that a hint of smugness in his eyes? Did he already know? "This is a joke, right?" Josie asked, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Not at all," Popo said briskly. "The official announcement goes out today, but we wanted to give you both a heads up so you can begin planning your strategy." "I don't need a partner," Josie insisted. "I've won 3 times on my own." "And lost once," Theo pointed out unhelpfully. Josie shot him a glare that would have wilted lesser men. "By half a point." "Still lost," he said with a shrug, but his eyes were dancing with something that looked suspiciously like excitement. He was enjoying this. The realization made Josie want to throw her dough at his perfectly stubbled face. "The rules are the rules," Gigi said, standing up with Genevieve the elegant grandmother poise. "Now we'll leave you two to get acquainted, or reacquainted as it were." "I think we're quite acquainted already," Josie said tightly. "Excellent," Popo beamed, joining Gigi. "Then you can move straight to planning. The theme this year is fusion, combining the best of different baking traditions." "How convenient," Josie muttered, staring daggers at her grandmother. "A French-Chinese fusion, perhaps?" "If you think that's best," Popo replied innocently. "We look forward to seeing what you come up with." The grandmothers gathered their things with suspicious efficiency, as if they'd planned this hasty exit. Gigi kissed Theo's cheek one more time. "Be good," she whispered, just loud enough for Josie to hear. "Always am," Theo replied with a wink that made Josie roll her eyes so hard it almost hurt. As soon as the bell signaled the grandmother's departure, Josie rounded on Theo. "Did you know about this?" Theo leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. "I had my suspicions when Grandmere insisted I take the apartment next to yours." "And you didn't think to warn me?" "Would you have believed me?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Josie turned back to her dough, kneading it with renewed vigor. "This is ridiculous. I'm not doing it. I'll withdraw." "And let Melissa Chen win by default?" Theo asked, mentioning Josie's bakery rival from across town. "I thought you were more competitive than that, Lin." Josie's hand stilled. He had a point, damn him. Melissa had been gunning for the Maplewood Bake-Off trophy for years, always coming in just behind Josie. The thought of simply handing her the victory was unacceptable. Theo rose from his seat, approaching her workstation with slow, measured steps. He leaned over, examining her dough with a critical eye, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something with notes of bergamot and cedar that shouldn't have been appealing but annoyingly was. "Seems overworked," he commented, gesturing at her brioche. "You're developing too much gluten." "It's fine," Josie snapped, resisting the urge to cover her dough protectively. "I know what I'm doing." "Never said you didn't," Theo replied, still far too close for comfort. "But if we're going to work together, we should probably meet to discuss strategy." "If," Josie emphasized. "When," Theo corrected, his confidence unshakable. His proximity was doing weird things to her ability to think clearly. Josie took a step back, forgetting the cooling rack of yesterday's experimental passion fruit tarts behind her. Her hip bumped it, sending the whole structure wobbling precariously. "Careful." Theo lunged forward, one hand steadying the rack while the other grabbed her arm to keep her from falling. They froze like that for a moment, his hand warm around her upper arm, their faces closer than they'd been in years. Josie could see the flecks of amber in his hazel eyes, the tiny scar above his right eyebrow from when they were 10 and she'd accidentally hit him with a wooden spoon. She jerked away first, his touch burning through the thin material of her blouse. "I've got it," she said stiffly, steadying the rack herself. Theo stepped back, running a hand through his hair, a nervous habit she pretended not to remember. "Still hate me that much, Lin?" he asked, his tone light but with an undercurrent of something that might have been hurt. Josie straightened her apron, forcing her face into what she hoped was a professional smile. "I don't hate you," she said, surprised to find it wasn't entirely a lie. "I just prefer winning without handicaps." The barb hit its mark. She saw the brief flash of surprise in his eyes before his easy smile returned. We'll see who's carrying who when we're done, he said, heading for the door. He paused, hand on the knob, and looked back at her. By the way, I can hear you practicing piano through our wall. Your Bach needs work, but your Chopin's not bad. Before Josie could formulate a response, he was gone, the bell tinkling in his wake. She stood in the sudden silence of her bakery, flour dust dancing in the morning sunlight, the ghost of his touch still warm on her arm. Through the window, she saw Gigi and Po waiting for Theo on the sidewalk, their expressions entirely too pleased. Josie picked up her rolling pin, gripping it like a weapon as she stared at the closed door. Partner with Theo Marchand? Fine. If that was the only way to win this year's bake-off, she'd do it. But she wasn't just going to win. She was going to thoroughly outshine her new neighbor in the process. And if that meant practicing her piano at midnight just to annoy him, well, that was just a bonus.
Chapter 2: Baking with the Enemy. Theo whistled a jaunty tune while strolling through Maplewood's morning market, enjoying how the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fresh produce and baked goods. His fingers danced over a display of apples, testing their firmness with practiced precision before selecting 6 perfect specimens. "Morning, Ms. Jenkins," he called out, deliberately raising his voice as he approached the spice vendor where the town's most notorious gossip was examining cinnamon sticks. Ms. Jenkins adjusted her glasses and peered at him with undisguised interest. "Theo Marchand. Just the man I was hoping to see. I heard the most fascinating rumor about you and—" "Fascinating rumors about me. I'm flattered," Theo cut her off with a wink. "But I'm just here for some premium ingredients." He made a show of examining the vanilla beans, selecting the Madagascar variety he knew was Josie's favorite, the ones she special ordered and complained were always sold out. "I'll take all of these," he said loudly enough for Ms. Jenkins to hear, watching from his peripheral vision as she practically vibrated with excitement. "They're Josie Lin's preferred beans, you know. For our collaboration." Ms. Jenkins nearly dropped her shopping basket. "Collaboration? You and Josie?" "For the bake-off," Theo said casually, counting bills from his wallet. "We're partners this year. Starting practice today, actually." He accepted the paper bag of vanilla beans with a theatrical sigh. "Between you and me, I think our grandmothers might be up to something." "Oh." Ms. Jenkins clutched her chest. "This is wonderful news. I mean, how interesting." Theo suppressed a smile. The Gossip Telegraph would be buzzing before he reached the bakery. "Have a lovely day, Ms. Jenkins. I'm sure I'll see you around town." He continued his shopping, selecting butter from the dairy stall and chatting with the farmer about his cows by name. The entire time he could feel Ms. Jenkins watching him, phone already in hand. Josie would know about the vanilla beans within the hour. Maybe less, given how efficiently Maplewood's gossip network operated. Perfect. When Theo pushed through the door of Marchand's patisserie 40 minutes later, his assistant Marcus was already piping delicate rosettes onto a tray of mini eclairs. The front of the shop gleamed with polished glass cases and elegant displays, but the kitchen was Theo's sanctuary, all stainless steel French copper pots and the constant hum of precision. "You're late," Marcus said without looking up from his piping. "And you've got that look on your face. Who are you tormenting now?" Theo dropped his market haul onto the prep counter. "I've been matched with Josie Lin for the Maplewood bake-off." The piping bag paused mid-rosette. "You're joking." "Would I joke about something this entertaining?" Theo grinned, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. "You should have seen her face when our grandmothers told her, turned the exact shade of those raspberries in the display case." Marcus set down his piping bag and folded his arms. "And you're happy about this arrangement?" "Happy? I'm ecstatic." Theo began unpacking his ingredients. Nothing is more entertaining than Josie Lin when she's flustered. Did you know she still counts to 10 under her breath when she's trying not to lose her temper? Been doing it since we were 8. You realize your grandmother is matchmaking again. Obviously, Theo scoffed, carefully arranging the vanilla beans in plain sight on the counter. Gigi's about as subtle as a brick through a window. But if she wants to create opportunities for me to remind Josie that I'm the superior baker, who am I to complain? MMHMM. Marcus picked up his piping bag again. So this has nothing to do with the fact that you've been low-key obsessed with Josie Lin since you came back to town. I am not obsessed, Theo protested, feeling a flush creeping up his neck. I'm professionally invested in our rivalry. Right. And that's why you adjusted our entire menu, after she mentioned offhandedly that she hated lavender in desserts. Theo pointed a wooden spoon at Marcus. That was a culinary decision. Lavender is overdone. You liked lavender fine until Josie said she hated it. I'm going to need you to manage the front this afternoon, Theo said, deliberately changing the subject. Josie and I are having our first practice session at Sweet Haven at 2. Marcus snorted. Should I prepare bail money or just bandages? Very funny. Theo picked up a whisk and twirled it between his fingers. We're both professionals. I'm sure we'll find some common ground. Yeah, and I'm sure you'll be completely professional and not do anything specifically to get under her skin. Theo grinned. Now where would the fun be in that? At precisely 1:45 p.m., Theo slipped through the back door of Sweet Haven Bakery, using the key that dangled from a hook beside their dumpster. Small towns had their perks, like predictable hiding places for spare keys. The Sweet Haven kitchen was smaller than his but undeniably charming, with open shelving and vintage mixing bowls displayed alongside modern equipment. Everything was meticulously organized, from the rainbow of sprinkle containers to the precisely labeled bins of flour and sugar. And there on the main counter sat the evidence of Josie's obsessive planning, a printed schedule, neatly labeled ingredients and measuring tools arranged by size. Beside them lay a stack of recipe cards, each one written in Josie's unmistakable handwriting, tight, precise letters with little flourishes on the capital letters. Theo couldn't help himself. He moved the flour container 3 inches to the left, switched the positions of the cinnamon and nutmeg, turned the recipe card slightly askew. Then he spotted a tray of test pastries cooling on the rack. Some kind of delicate fruit tart with a custard base, classic Josie, precise and pretty but predictably safe. He picked one up and took a bite, leaning back against the counter as the flavors hit his tongue. Good balance, nice acidity from the berries, but... The bell above the front door jingled, followed by swift footsteps. Theo took another large bite of the tart just as Josie burst through the swinging door, her cheeks flushed from the autumn chill, a scarf wound tightly around her neck. She froze when she saw him, her eyes darting from his face to the half-eaten tart in his hand, then to her rearranged ingredients. This could use more cardamom, he said through his mouthful, watching as her expression shifted from surprise to irritation. The custard's bland. Josie closed her eyes briefly, her lips moving as she silently counted. 1, 2, 3. Why are you already in my kitchen? She asked when she reached 10, her voice admirably controlled as she hung her coat on the rack by the door. And how did you get in? Back door was open, Theo lied smoothly. I'm 15 minutes early because punctuality is next to godliness. Or is that cleanliness? Never can remember. The back door was not open. Then perhaps you should find a better hiding spot for your spare key than on the hook by the dumpster. Very original, by the way. No one would ever think to look there. Josie's jaw tightened. You can't just let yourself into my bakery. Our practice space, he corrected, finishing the tart with one last bite. For the next 3 weeks this kitchen is our shared domain. Per the official rules of the competition. He watched as she took in the subtle changes he'd made to her meticulously arranged workspace. Her nostrils flared slightly, but instead of recounting, she simply moved to the sink and washed her hands with precise, efficient movements. I've prepared a detailed practice schedule, she said, drying her hands on a towel embroidered with cherries. We'll start with technique assessment today, then move on to flavor profile development tomorrow and... Sounds riveting, Theo interrupted, pushing himself off the counter. Or we could just bake something and see how our styles mesh. Baking without a plan is how disasters happen. And baking without spontaneity is how boring happens, he countered, stepping closer to the counter where her binder sat. What's this? The Encyclopedia Britannica of baking? Josie snatched up the thick binder before he could touch it. This is 3 weeks of carefully structured practice sessions designed to maximize our chances of winning. May I? He held out his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she surrendered the binder. Theo flipped through pages of color-coded schedules, precise recipes and notes on flavor combinations. Every day was mapped out in 15-minute increments, with contingency plans for possible mishaps. It was so utterly, perfectly Josie that he couldn't help but smile. "This is thorough," he said, feigning academic interest before setting the binder aside with deliberate carelessness. "Plans are for people who don't trust their instincts." He rolled up his sleeves, exposing his forearms, and noticing how Josie's eyes flickered to them before stubbornly looking away. "Interesting. Let's start simple," he said, reaching for the flour bin. "Show me how you make pastry dough." "We should follow the recipe I've developed." "I want to see how you work," Theo interrupted, leaning against the counter. "Show me your technique, not what some recipe tells you to do." Josie's mouth pressed into a line, but she efficiently tied on her apron, a frilly yellow number with "Sweet dreams are made of cheese" embroidered across the front. Despite himself, Theo felt the corner of his mouth quirk up. "Fine," she said. "But we're measuring everything properly." She pulled out a digital scale and began measuring ingredients with scientific precision. 250 grams of flour, 175 grams of cold butter cut into precise cubes, 1 teaspoon of salt. Theo watched her hands, small but confident, as they moved through the familiar motions. There was something mesmerizing about the efficiency of her movements, not a gesture wasted, everything purposeful. So different from his own more intuitive approach. "You're doing this by hand? Not the food processor?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Better texture," she replied without looking up. "The processor overworks the dough." "Something we agree on," Theo murmured, stepping closer to watch as she began to work the butter into the flour with her fingertips. Her technique was flawless, but he could see she was being too gentle with the mixture. Without thinking, he reached for the bowl. "You need to work it more aggressively at this stage," he said, his hands diving into the mixture beside hers. "Like this." Their fingers brushed in the flour-butter mixture, and Josie immediately pulled back as if burned. "I know how to make pastry dough." "I'm sure you do," Theo said, continuing to work the mixture. "But you're being too cautious. See how I'm leaving larger chunks of butter? That's what creates the layers." Josie folded her arms across her chest. "I was getting to that." "Now we add the water," he continued, reaching for the measuring cup she'd prepared. "But not all at once. The recipe might say 60 milliliters, but the amount depends on humidity and flour absorption," she finished for him. "I know that, Marchand." Theo grinned, deliberately adding less water than her measurement. "Then you also know we need to test the consistency before adding the full amount." He worked the dough with quick, confident motions, then held out a piece to her. "Feel this." "Too dry." When she didn't move, he reached for her hand and pressed the dough into her palm. "See? Trust your fingers, not the measurement." Josie's cheeks flushed as she quickly pulled her hand away, but her fingers curled around the dough sample. "It needs more water," she grudgingly admitted. "Exactly." Theo reached for the water, but instead of using her precisely measured amount, he simply added a splash directly to the bowl. "What are you doing?" Josie looked horrified. "You didn't measure." "I measured with my eyes," he replied, working the additional water into the dough. "Perfect now. Want to feel?" "No, thank you," she said stiffly, moving to the refrigerator. "We need to chill this while we prepare the filling." Theo wrapped the dough while Josie gathered ingredients for a fruit filling. She placed a small bowl of spices on the counter, measuring out cinnamon with a precise 1/4 teaspoon. "What are we making?" he asked, watching as she began peeling and slicing the apples he'd bought that morning. "Apple tart. Classic, crowd-pleasing, good test of our basic skills." She worked methodically, her knife moving in confident, even strokes. "We'll toss the apples with sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of lemon juice." Theo nodded, watching her measure the sugar. When she turned to retrieve the lemon, he casually reached for her spice rack and grabbed the nutmeg, sprinkling a generous amount onto the apples. Josie turned back just in time to see him. "What are you doing? That's not in the recipe." "The recipe isn't the boss of me," Theo replied with a wink. "And neither are you, Lin." "This is exactly why we need a plan," she huffed, looking at the nutmeg-dusted apples with dismay. "You can't just add random spices. Nutmeg isn't random with apples. It's classic." He reached for another jar. "You know what else would be good? A pinch of cardamom." "Don't you dare." Too late. A generous pinch of cardamom joined the mixture. Josie looked like she might spontaneously combust. Relax, Theo said, stirring the spices into the fruit. Taste it before you judge it. He held out a slice of spiced apple. After a moment of visible internal struggle, Josie took it and put it in her mouth. Her expression remained neutral, but Theo caught the slight widening of her eyes. It's not terrible, she admitted reluctantly. High praise indeed, Theo laughed. Now where's your vanilla? It'll really bring everything together. Josie moved to block his access to a small shelf where several extract bottles sat. We're not using the vanilla. It doesn't need it. Everything needs vanilla, Theo insisted, trying to reach around her. Don't be stingy, Lin. That's my special reserve vanilla, she protested. It's for competition only. And what is this if not competition practice? Theo stretched his arm past her, fingers brushing the bottle labeled Madagascar Bourbon Vanilla Competition Only in Josie's neat handwriting. Theo, no. She lunged forward, colliding with his arm just as he grabbed the bottle. Their collision caused his hand to jerk, and a much larger amount of vanilla extract than intended splashed into the apple mixture. The rich, fragrant scent immediately filled the air between them. For a moment they both froze, Josie's hand wrapped around his wrist, their faces inches apart. Her eyes widened in horror as she stared at the pool of vanilla spreading through the apple mixture. Do you have any idea how expensive that is? She whispered. Instead of apologizing, Theo dipped his finger into the mixture and brought it to his lips. The flavors exploded on his tongue, tart apple, warm spices, and the deep, complex note of premium vanilla. Infinitely better now, he declared with complete honesty. Try it. Josie released his wrist as if it had suddenly caught fire. You are the most undisciplined, reckless baker I've ever met. Baking is a science, Marchand. It requires precision, discipline, and respect for ingredients. She launched into a lecture about proper technique and the importance of following recipes, moving around the kitchen with sharp, irritated gestures. Theo found himself not listening to her words but watching the way her hands moved as she talked, the flour dusting her left cheek, the way her eyes flashed when she was passionate about something. The afternoon light from the kitchen window caught in her hair, highlighting strands of caramel among the dark brown. Had those always been there? He couldn't remember noticing before. And the tiny baking-themed earrings she wore today, miniature rolling pins that swayed when she gestured emphatically. Are you even listening to me? Josie demanded, snapping him back to attention. Something about discipline and precision, Theo replied automatically. Which, by the way, are vastly overrated in creative fields. Baking is both an art and a science, she countered, placing her hands on her hips. You need structure before you can improvise. They were standing unnecessarily close now, Josie having moved into his space to make her point. Theo was suddenly very aware of the height difference between them, how she had to tilt her chin up to maintain eye contact when they stood this close. The kitchen door swung open, interrupting their standoff. Eli, Josie's business partner and best friend, poked his head in and took in the scene. Flour everywhere, apple mixture pooled on the counter, Josie and Theo standing toe-to-toe. So it's going well then, Eli said dryly, his gaze moving between them with knowing amusement. Eli. Josie stepped back quickly. We're just practicing, Theo finished for her. Finding our rhythm. Aha. Eli's expression remained skeptical. Just checking that no one needs medical attention or a fire extinguisher. His eyes lingered on Theo. Yet? We're fine, Josie insisted. Just a slight disagreement about methodology. Slight? Eli raised an eyebrow. The whole front of the shop heard you yelling about vanilla extract. I wasn't yelling, Josie muttered, brushing flour from her apron. I was expressing concerns firmly. Eli snorted. Whatever you say, boss. I'm heading out, bread delivery's all done for the day. Try not to burn the place down, kids. He retreated, the door swinging shut behind him. In the awkward silence that followed, Theo turned to survey the rest of the kitchen, his eyes catching on something colorful pinned to a bulletin board near the back door. He moved closer, surprised to find a faded photograph among the invoices and reminder notes. It showed two children, maybe 12 years old, standing proudly beside a lopsided cake. Both were covered in chocolate batter, grinning widely at the camera. Theo recognized himself immediately, gangly limbs too, big chef hat sliding over one eye. And next to him Josie, with her gap-toothed smile and determination shining in her eyes. The junior baker competition, their first year entering. They'd made a disastrous chocolate cake together that somehow won third place, mostly because the judges thought their enthusiasm was adorable. "You kept this?" Theo asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. When Josie didn't immediately answer, he turned to find her watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. "It's just bakery history," she said finally, turning back to the apple mixture. "I keep all the competition mementos." Theo nodded, not pushing further despite the warmth that had spread through his chest at the sight of the photograph. Before Josie had become his rival, she had been his friend, his best friend really. They'd spent countless afternoons in her grandmother's kitchen, covered in flour and dreaming of opening their own bakeries someday. He'd never admitted to anyone how much he regretted the way things ended before he left for Paris. They worked in relative silence after that, rolling out the dough and assembling the tart. Despite their wildly different approaches, the finished product looked surprisingly good, rustic but elegant, with perfectly caramelized apples nestled in golden pastry. "Not bad," Josie admitted as she removed it from the oven, the scent of spiced apples filling the kitchen. "For an improvisational disaster." "You mean a creative triumph," Theo corrected, inhaling deeply. The cardamom was the right call. "And the nutmeg," she conceded reluctantly. "But we still need a real plan for the competition." Theo wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, then reached out and brushed flour from Josie's nose with his thumb. She froze at the contact, her eyes widening slightly. "Same time tomorrow, partner?" he asked, his voice deliberately light despite the sudden tension between them. Josie wiped away the flour with the back of her hand, her eyes narrowed. But she didn't immediately object to his touch or his question, which Theo counted as progress. 3 o'clock, she said finally. "And bring your own apron. And don't touch my vanilla again." "Yes, chef," Theo replied with a mock salute, gathering his jacket. As he stepped out into the cooling afternoon air, he felt an unexpected flutter of something beyond mere amusement in his chest. Playing with fire had always been his specialty, but for the first time he wondered if he might be the one who ended up getting burned.
Chapter 3: Close Quarters and Flying Flour. Josie yanked the bakery door shut behind her, the pre-dawn darkness still heavy in the air. 4:30 in the morning was an ungodly hour to anyone except bakers and insomniacs, and at this point she qualified as both. Sleep had eluded her after yesterday's disaster with Theo. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his smug face and heard his casual dismissal of her meticulously measured ingredients. "A pinch of this, a dash of that," she muttered, mimicking his infuriatingly casual tone as she flipped on the lights. "Who bakes like that? Absolutely no precision whatsoever." Sweet Haven came to life around her, the hum of refrigerators, the faint scent of yesterday's pastries, the familiar comfort of her domain. Here she made the rules. Here she was in control. And today, she would maintain that control if it killed her. Josie dropped her bag on the counter and pulled out a notepad with color-coded sections. Operation Contain Theo's Chaos was officially underway. She'd spent half the night drafting a battle plan that would minimize his destructive influence on their practice session. "Step 1, she announced to the empty kitchen. "Establish clear workstations." She moved through the bakery with military precision, arranging measuring cups by exact size, lining up mixing bowls from smallest to largest, and setting up labeled stations for each step of their recipe. Every ingredient was pre-weighed and placed in individual containers with sticky notes indicating their exact purpose. "Vanilla extract for pastry cream only," she wrote in bold letters, still annoyed that he'd added extra to their dough yesterday, claiming it needed something. By 6 o'clock, the kitchen looked like a baking laboratory. Josie stood back to admire her work, hands on her hips. "Let's see him freestyle his way through this," she said, satisfaction warming her chest. She was heading to the coffee machine when she noticed the newest edition of the Maplewood Gazette sitting on the front counter. Eli must have brought it in when he'd closed up yesterday. She picked it up absently, flipping through local announcements and ads for the fall festival while her coffee brewed. When she reached page 3, Josie froze mid-turn. "You have got to be kidding me." There, in glorious half-page spreads, was Margot DuPont's weekly column. And this week's headline read, Mixed Ingredients. Will Maplewood's rival bakers rise to the occasion together? Underneath was a candid photo of her and Theo arguing on the sidewalk in front of Sweet Haven, her finger jabbing his chest, his eyebrows raised in that infuriating way that made her want to. No, Josie muttered. No, no, no. She scanned the article, her outrage growing with each paragraph. The unexpected pairing of Maplewood's most notorious culinary rivals has the town buzzing, she read aloud, her voice rising with each word. Sources close to the situation suggest the partnership was orchestrated by none other than their grandmothers, local matchmaking legends May Lin and Genevieve Marchand. Josie paced the kitchen, the newspaper crumpled in her white-knuckled grip. The chemistry between them is palpable, she continued, practically choking on the words. Whether it's enough to create award-winning pastries or just explosive arguments remains to be seen. This reporter wonders if there might be more rising between them than just perfectly proofed dough. She slammed the paper down on the counter. I'm going to kill Margot. And then I'm going to kill Po. And then? The bell above the door chimed, cutting off her murder plans. Josie whipped around to see Theo strolling in, 15 minutes early, again, carrying a cardboard box of what looked like specialty ingredients and 2 coffee cups. Morning sunshine, he called, his voice far too cheerful for 6:15 a.m. You look like you're plotting someone's murder. Is it mine? Because if so, can I at least finish my coffee first? Everyone in this town is on my list right now, she growled, quickly folding the newspaper and shoving it under the counter. The last thing she needed was Theo reading Margot's ridiculous insinuations. He set one of the coffee cups on the counter and slid it toward her. Oat milk, 1 sugar. Black would be better, but I remember your sweet tooth. Josie stared at the cup suspiciously. How do you remember my coffee order from high school? You're predictable, Lin. He shrugged, a half-smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Same coffee order, same competitive streak, same adorable flower smudge on your left cheek whenever you're stressed. Her hand flew to her face before she could stop herself, and Theo's smile widened. Made you look, he said softly, and something in his tone made her stomach flip. But seriously, the coffee's a peace offering. Yesterday was chaotic. Josie accepted the cup cautiously. That's one word for it. She took a sip, perfectly made exactly how she liked it, and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that came with knowing he remembered such a small detail about her after all these years. What else did he remember? She cleared her throat. So, I've been thinking about our approach. I can see that. Theo surveyed the meticulously organized kitchen with raised eyebrows. Did the military stop by to help you set up, or did you manage this level of rigidity all on your own? It's called organization, she said through gritted teeth. Something you might want to try. Where's the fun in that? He set his box on the counter and began unpacking, jars of specialty spices, premium chocolate, and a small container of what looked like edible gold flakes. Besides, too much structure kills creativity. Josie took a deep breath, reminding herself that strangling her baking partner would disqualify them from the competition. Here's the plan, she said, pulling out her notepad. We're going to make the exact same recipe, separately but side by side. Same ingredients, same measurements. The only difference will be our techniques. That way, we can objectively see whose method works better. Theo's eyes lit up with amusement. A bake-off within a bake-off? You're on. He agreed too easily, which immediately set off alarm bells in Josie's head. Theo Marchand never surrendered without a fight. He was up to something, but she couldn't figure out what. Great, she said cautiously. We'll start with a pâte-à-choux. I've already measured out. I brought my own ingredients, he interrupted, patting his box. I don't trust pre-measured anything. Of course he didn't. That would be too easy. They settled into an uneasy rhythm, working at adjacent stations, with Josie's meticulous setup on one side and Theo's creative chaos on the other. She tried to focus on her own pastry, but her eyes kept drifting to his workstation. The way his hands moved was almost hypnotic, confident, practiced, with a casual grace that made even the most technical tasks look effortless. He kneaded dough with strong, steady movements, his fingers pressing and folding with practiced precision that contradicted his supposedly haphazard approach. When he tasted his pastry cream, his expression turned thoughtful, eyes half closed as he considered the flavor. A small dab of cream lingered at the corner of his mouth, and before Josie could look away, his tongue darted out to catch it. Something hot and uncomfortable knotted in her stomach. "You need more vanilla," he called without looking up, and she realized he'd caught her staring. "My vanilla is perfectly measured according to the recipe," she countered, turning back to her own station. "The recipe is wrong." The recipe won the regional baking championship 3 years running. And it would have won 4 if the vanilla was right. Josie huffed and grabbed her piping bag with more force than necessary. She squeezed too hard, and the choux pastry spurted out in an uneven line. Great. Now she'd have to scrape it off and start again. She was so focused on fixing her mistake that she didn't notice Theo reaching across her for the vanilla extract. His arm brushed against hers, startling her, and she jerked backward, bumping the flour container with her elbow. A white cloud erupted between them, hanging in the air for a suspended moment before settling, mostly on Josie. She stood frozen in shock, feeling the fine powder coat her hair, face, and the front of her apron. Theo's laughter broke the silence. Not his usual smug chuckle, but a genuine, full-bodied laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes and revealed the dimple in his left cheek that she'd definitely not noticed before. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "But you should see your face right now." Before she could respond, he reached out and brushed his thumb lightly across her cheek, sending a shower of flour drifting down to her apron. "White is definitely your color," he murmured, his voice suddenly lower. Something electric zipped through her at his touch. She stepped back, her hip hitting the counter. "You did that on purpose," she accused, trying to recover her composure. Theo raised his hands in mock surrender. "Cross my heart, it was an accident. Though your reaction was worth it." Josie narrowed her eyes, then casually reached for the vanilla. "Well, accidents happen." With a flick of her wrist, she sent a small puff of flour directly into his face. Theo blinked in shock, white powder dusting his eyelashes and settling in his dark hair. For a terrifying second, Josie thought she'd crossed a line. Then his expression shifted into something dangerous and playful. "Oh, now you've done it," he said, grabbing a small handful of flour from his station. With deliberate slowness, he reached over and dumped it on top of her head. "Now we're even." Josie gasped as flour rained down through her hair. "You did not just do that in my kitchen." "What are you going to do about it?" he challenged, his eyes gleaming with mischief. The rational part of her brain, the part that had created color-coded charts and measured ingredients to the gram, screamed that they were wasting time and making a mess of her pristine kitchen. That part was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming urge to wipe that smug smile off his face. Josie lunged for the flour container, scooping up a handful and lobbing it at Theo's chest. It hit with a satisfying poof, leaving a perfect white handprint on his black Henley. "This means war," he declared, and chaos erupted. Josie darted behind the central island, as Theo armed himself with a fistful of powdered sugar. She grabbed a sheet pan as a shield, deflecting his attack while searching for ammunition. "Your tactical advantage is slipping, Lin," he called, flanking her position. She squealed, actually squealed, when he caught her by the waist, lifting her briefly as she twisted away. She retaliated by smearing a handful of cocoa powder across his shoulder. "Not the good chocolate," he protested, laughing as he pursued her around the prep table. The professional kitchen transformed into a battleground, flour handprints marking territories, sugar crunching underfoot, and the air thick with the dust of ingredients never meant to be used as projectiles. Somewhere in the madness, Josie realized she was laughing too, harder than she had in months. Theo cornered her against the industrial refrigerator, one arm braced above her shoulder, the other holding his last handful of flour in a clear threat. Both were breathing heavily, faces inches apart. This close, she could see the flecks of green in his hazel eyes, the slight stubble along his jaw, the way his smile softened when he wasn't purposely trying to annoy her. "Surrender?" he asked, his voice husky. "Never," she whispered back, suddenly aware of how little space separated them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and it wasn't just from the exertion of their flower battle. The bell above the door jingled, and Eli's voice cut through their bubble. "When I said you two needed to work out your tension, this isn't what I meant." Josie jumped away from Theo so fast she nearly gave herself whiplash. Eli stood in the doorway, surveying the destruction with an expression that hovered between amusement and exasperation. "Should I come back later?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Maybe after you've finished, whatever this is." Heat rushed to Josie's face as she realized how the scene must look. Her pressed against the refrigerator, Theo looming over her, both covered head to toe in baking ingredients and breathing like they'd run a marathon. "We were just testing techniques," she stammered. "Aha." Eli nodded slowly. "The classic flower fight as foreplay technique. Very traditional." "It's not, we weren't." Josie smoothed down her apron, which only succeeded in smearing flour across it. "We were having a disagreement about methods." "Clearly," Eli said dryly. "Your method seems to be, cover Theo in cocoa powder. Very professional." Theo, unhelpfully, was shaking with silent laughter beside her. Mortification crashed over Josie in waves. What was she doing? This wasn't a playground, it was her business, her livelihood. And she just engaged in a food fight like a child. "We're done for today," she announced, unable to look at either of them. "Theo, you should go. We'll continue tomorrow after I've cleaned up this disaster." To her relief, Theo didn't argue. He brushed futilely at his flour-covered clothes and began gathering his things, still looking far too amused for someone who'd just been kicked out. As he passed her on his way to the door, he leaned in close enough that she could smell vanilla and chocolate on his skin beneath the cloud of flour. "For the record," he murmured, "your technique is still too rigid, but that was the most fun I've had in this kitchen since we were kids." Then he was gone, leaving her standing in a war zone of ingredients with Eli's knowing gaze boring into her back. "Not a word," she warned, pointing a flour-covered finger at her friend. Eli mimed zipping his lips, but his eyes danced with mischief. "I didn't say anything. But if you're looking for a slogan for the bakery, might I suggest Sweet Haven, where flour fights lead to charged moments against refrigerators? I will fire you." "No, you won't. You need me to help clean this up." He grabbed a broom from the supply closet. Besides, who else would serve as witness to the Great Flour Massacre of 2023? Josie groaned and began aggressively wiping down the counters, trying not to think about how Theo's eyes had crinkled when he laughed or the warmth of his breath against her cheek. "It wasn't a charged moment," she insisted. "It was a momentary lapse in judgment that will not be repeated. Whatever helps you sleep at night, boss." She scrubbed harder, channeling her confusion into cleaning. 20 minutes into their cleanup effort, Eli headed to the front to prepare the displays for opening. Josie moved to Theo's abandoned workstation to clear away his mess, and noticed he'd left his notebook behind. She picked it up, intending to set it aside for tomorrow. The book fell open in her hands, revealing pages of hastily scribbled notes. She should close it immediately. It was private, and snooping would make her as bad as Margot DuPont. But the heading at the top of the page caught her eye: "Things Josie does right, don't tell her." Her eyes skimmed down before she could stop herself. 1. Her pastry cream ratio is perfect, better than Chef Michel's in Paris. The list continued for half the page, detailed observations about techniques she didn't even realize anyone had noticed, let alone appreciated. At the bottom, he'd written and underlined, "She still does that thing where she bites her lip when she's concentrating. Still distracting." Josie snapped the book shut, her heart racing. She set it down carefully, as if it might explode, and stepped back. The warmth spreading through her chest was professional satisfaction, she told herself firmly. Nothing more than the validation that her rival recognized her skills, even if he was too stubborn to admit it to her face. It certainly wasn't because of that last note, or the way he'd said "still" twice, as if he'd been watching her for years, noticing little habits she wasn't even aware of herself. She took a deep breath and returned to cleaning, but the memory of his notebook refused to fade, much like the stubborn flour handprint on her apron that looked suspiciously like it belonged to Theo.
Chapter 4: The Almost Kiss. Theo stood at the window of his apartment, scanning his weather app with a frown. Dark clouds churned overhead, threatening the kind of downpour that turned Maplewood's charming streets into miniature rivers. Perfect. Just perfect. Today of all days. He fired off a quick text to Josie. Think we should reschedule our supply run? Looks like a storm's coming. Her response pinged back almost immediately. A little rain never hurt anyone. Meet me there in 20. He could practically feel her stubbornness radiating through the phone. Of course she wouldn't reschedule. Heaven forbid Josie Lin ever admit that Mother Nature might interfere with her meticulously planned schedule. Fine, he muttered, grabbing his jacket. But don't blame me when your precious recipe cards get soaked. 20 minutes later, Theo pushed open the door to Maplewood's specialty ingredient shop, a bell jangling cheerfully above his head. The place was a baker's dream, shelves lined with exotic spices, premium chocolates, and every conceivable type of flour. The rich scent of cinnamon and vanilla hung in the air, promising culinary magic to anyone who knew what to do with it. And there was Josie, already deep in conversation with Mrs. Chen, the shop's elderly owner. She stood at the counter, one hand on her hip, the other gesturing emphatically between two different glass vials of vanilla beans. The floral notes in the Tahitian are perfect for custards, she insisted, her brow furrowed in concentration, but for the depth we need in the chocolate layer. Mrs. Chen, what do you think? Theo couldn't help but smile. Only Josie would treat vanilla selection with the gravity of nuclear disarmament negotiations. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wore her favorite red sweater, the one with tiny embroidered rolling pins along the hem that she thought nobody noticed. He'd noticed. He noticed everything about her. Mrs. Chen spotted him first. Ah. Young Mr. Marchand. Come settle this debate before Miss Lin gives herself a headache. Josie's head snapped up, her expression shifting instantly, the open enthusiasm replaced by something more guarded, more measured. Not quite hostility, but definitely caution. Like someone who'd been burned before and wasn't eager for a repeat performance. Marchand, she acknowledged with a nod. Tell Mrs. Chen that Madagascar vanilla is clearly superior for our purposes. I don't know, he drawled, sliding up to the counter and deliberately standing close enough to make her shuffle sideways. I've always been partial to Tahitian myself. More complex. He picked up one of the vials, turning it in the light. Josie rolled her eyes. Of course you'd go with the showier option. Says the woman who put edible gold dust on her lemon tarts last spring. That was for a wedding. It was thematic. It was excessive, he grinned, and you know it. Mrs. Chen chuckled, the sound like rustling paper. Why not buy both? Best of both worlds. Both? Josie looked scandalized. That's not how recipes work. You can't just blend them? Theo interjected. I do it all the time. A little Madagascar for depth, a little Tahitian for floral notes. Best vanilla extract you'll ever taste. Josie stared at him like he'd suggested they bake a cake with dirt. You're making that up. I'm not, he shrugged. Try it sometime. When you're feeling adventurous. The way her cheeks flushed at the challenge was almost too satisfying. She grabbed both vials with a huff. Fine. We'll get both. But if it ruins our vanilla cream, I'm blaming you on live television. They moved through the shop, filling their baskets with ingredients for their bake-off practice sessions. What should have been a simple shopping trip rapidly evolved into an Olympic sport, both of them darting between aisles, reaching for the same items at the same time. That's the last bar of Valrhona, Josie said, her fingers closing around the premium chocolate just as Theo reached for it. I saw it first, he argued, his hand brushing against hers. I touched it first, she countered, not letting go. We could share it? She narrowed her eyes. What happened to the Theo who hoarded the good chocolate in culinary school? The one who literally labeled his ingredients with death threats? He grew up, Theo replied, then couldn't resist adding, a little. A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. Fine. We'll split it. But I get to break it. They moved to the spice section, where Theo watched in amusement as Josie meticulously examined every single cardamom pod container like she was inspecting diamonds. These look fresher, she declared, holding up one jar. Those have been sitting under the heating vent, Theo pointed out, reaching past her to grab a different container from the back. These ones still have their oils intact. See the sheen? Josie plucked the jar from his hands, her fingers warm against his. How do you even notice these things? Same way you can tell when butter is exactly the right temperature just by looking at it, he said. Some things you just know. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, a flash of recognition perhaps. The acknowledgement that despite everything, they understood each other in ways few others could. Mrs. Chen appeared beside them, sorting through a box of cinnamon sticks. You two still fight like children, she observed with a knowing smile. But now it looks different. Different? Theo asked, ignoring the way his heart skipped. The old woman just smiled enigmatically. Different? She patted his arm before shuffling away, leaving him wondering what exactly she meant. By the time they'd filled their baskets and paid, the sky had darkened considerably. Theo glanced through the shop window with concern. We should hurry. That doesn't look good. Josie followed his gaze, frowning at the ominous clouds. It's just a little? The heavens chose that moment to open up. What had been a light drizzle transformed instantly into a torrential downpour, rain battering against the windows with alarming force. You were saying? Theo smirked. Shut up, Josie muttered, peering outside with dismay. It'll pass. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a boom of thunder that rattled the shop windows. I don't think it's passing anytime soon, Theo said. He glanced across the street, where the darkened windows of Marchand's patisserie waited. My place is right there. We can wait it out. Josie hesitated, clutching her shopping bags closer. The reluctance on her face was clear. Entering his territory, his space, was crossing some invisible line she'd drawn between them. Another lightning flash decided for her. Fine, she conceded. But only until it lets up. They darted out into the deluge, paper bags clutched protectively to their chests. The rain was merciless, soaking through Theo's jacket in seconds. He kept one eye on Josie as they sprinted across the street, watching her dodge puddles with surprising agility. By the time they reached his patisserie, they were both drenched. Theo fumbled with his keys, trying to shield the lock from the rain with his body. The door finally swung open, and they tumbled inside, breathless and dripping. In the dim light of the closed bakery, Theo could see Josie shivering slightly. Her thin blouse clung to her skin, hair plastered to her face, water droplets sliding down her neck. She set her bags carefully on a nearby table, wincing at the puddle forming at her feet. I'll get towels, he said quickly, heading toward the back. And something hot to drink. In the small staff room, Theo grabbed the plush towels he kept for emergencies and put milk on to heat for hot chocolate. He caught his reflection in the small mirror above the sink, hair wild from the rain, white shirt nearly transparent. He ran a hand through his damp locks, attempting to tame them, then realized he was primping and stopped immediately. It's just Josie, he told his reflection firmly. Nothing's changed. Even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Something was changing, had been changing since the moment he'd returned to Maplewood. He just wasn't ready to name it yet. When he returned with towels and 2 steaming mugs of his specialty hot chocolate, dark chocolate with a hint of chili and cinnamon, Josie was standing by the display cases examining his pastries. The sight of her there in his space, surrounded by his creations, created an odd tightness in his chest. Here, he said, holding out a navy blue towel. Before you catch pneumonia and blame me for that too. She accepted it with a small smile, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Thanks. Theo tried not to stare as she ran the towel through her hair, droplets cascading down her neck, disappearing into the collar of her blouse. He forced himself to look away, focusing intently on drying his own hair. Your hot chocolate, he said, clearing his throat and offering her a mug once she'd finished with the towel. Josie wrapped her hands around it gratefully. Thanks. I'm always freezing when I get wet. I remember, he said without thinking. You used to wear those ridiculous rainbow mittens, even in early fall. Something flickered across her face, surprised that he'd remembered such a detail perhaps. My mom still buys me a new pair every Christmas, she admitted. I have about 15 pairs now. The rain continued to pound against the windows, creating a strangely intimate atmosphere in the darkened bakery. Awkward silence settled between them, filled only by the occasional rumble of thunder. Josie broke it first, wandering slowly around his display cases. Her fingers hovered just above the glass as she studied each creation, classic French opera cakes, gleaming fruit tarts, delicate eclairs. "It's very you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Sophisticated. Perfect." There was something in her tone, not quite bitterness but a hint of hurt, that made Theo step closer. He recognized it because he'd heard it before, years ago, when they were just teenagers and she thought he wasn't listening. "Not perfect," he corrected, moving beside her and pointing to a burn mark on the edge of a particularly elaborate Napoleon. "See that?" She leaned closer, peering at the slight imperfection. "You actually sell something with a burn on it? In your display case?" "You?" "I keep it there to remind myself." "Of what?" she asked, looking up at him with genuine curiosity. "That perfection is overrated," he said honestly. "And that mistakes are where you learn." Their eyes locked, and suddenly they weren't talking about pastry anymore. The air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and questions that had lingered for years. A crash of thunder shook the building, making Josie jump slightly. She took a step back, breaking the spell, and wrapped her arms around herself. "Why didn't you say goodbye?" The question tumbled from her lips, hanging in the space between them. Her voice was steady but vulnerable, in a way Theo rarely heard from her. "You just left." The question hit him like a physical blow. He'd known it was coming eventually, had been waiting for it, dreading it since the day he'd returned to Maplewood. He leaned against the counter, his heart pounding harder than it did during competition finals. "My father," he began, then stopped, trying to find the right words. "He called in every favor he had to get me that spot at Leclerc. It was the opportunity of a lifetime." "I know that," Josie said, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Everyone knew that. What I don't understand is why you couldn't take 5 minutes to tell me yourself." Theo ran a hand through his damp hair. How could he explain the confusion of an 18-year-old boy, torn between his dreams and the crushing fear that he wasn't good enough to achieve them? "My father made it clear that becoming a world-class pastry chef meant leaving everything behind," he said carefully. "No distractions," he called it. "Just total focus." And I believed him because that's what he did. Left everything behind for his career. Including Theo's mother, though he didn't say that part aloud. "So I was a distraction?" Josie's voice was quiet. "No," Theo said firmly. "You were." He searched for the right word. "Complicated." "Complicated," she repeated, as if testing the shape of the word. "I thought leaving would push me forward," he admitted, his voice low. "But all it did was make me realize how much I missed." He paused, the words he wanted to say, "missed you," catching in his throat. "This place," he finished instead. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the windows, filling the silence that stretched between them. Josie set her mug down on a nearby table and took a step toward him. "And now you're back," she said. Not a question, but a statement filled with unspoken meaning. "I'm back," he echoed, watching as she moved closer. Rain still dripped from her hair, catching the low light. Without thinking, Theo reached out, brushing a wet strand from her face. His hand lingered on her cheek, and to his surprise, she didn't pull away. Time seemed suspended as he leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. Josie didn't move away, her breath catching. The space between them crackled with a tension that had been building for longer than either wanted to admit. Just as the distance between them nearly closed, a loud banging on the door shattered the moment. "Josie?" Eli's voice called from outside. "Your grandmother said you might be here." They jumped apart, Josie's eyes wide with something like panic. Theo held her gaze a moment longer, trying to communicate without words that whatever almost happened wasn't a mistake, at least not to him. Josie's cheeks flushed as she grabbed her bags from the table. We should. "Yeah," Theo nodded, running a hand through his hair again. "Practice session tomorrow?" "Right. Tomorrow." She hurried to the door, pulling it open to reveal a very wet, very curious-looking Eli. Eli's eyebrows shot up as he took in the scene, Josie's flushed face, Theo's rumpled appearance, the empty mugs on the table. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked, not even trying to hide his smirk. "No," Josie said too quickly. "We were just waiting out the rain. Getting supplies. For the competition." "Uh-huh," Eli nodded, clearly not buying it. "Well, Popo May sent me to find you. Something about needing your help with a special project." He made air quotes around the last two words. Josie groaned. Not another matchmaking scheme. Probably, Eli agreed cheerfully. But hey, at least it gives you an excuse to escape, whatever this isn't. He gestured vaguely between Josie and Theo. We'll talk tomorrow, Theo called as Josie stepped out into the drizzle. About the recipe, he added hastily. Josie nodded, not quite meeting his eyes. Tomorrow. As the door swung shut behind them, Theo leaned against the counter, staring at the space where Josie had been standing moments before. The bakery felt suddenly empty, the rain against the windows no longer cozy but merely persistent. He picked up the mugs, carrying them to the sink. The hot chocolate had grown cold, much like the moment that had slipped through his fingers. Timing, he muttered to himself. Always had a problem with timing.
Chapter 5, The Final Bake-Off Showdown. Josie parked her old Subaru 3 spaces away from the community center's side entrance. 30 minutes early. Excellent. She turned off the ignition, exhaled slowly, and gripped the steering wheel hard enough to whiten her knuckles. This was supposed to be her moment, the 4th Maplewood Bake-Off trophy, to prove once and for all that she was the best baker in town. Instead, she'd be sharing the spotlight with Theo Marchand. Again. She glanced at the passenger seat, where a box of her specialty tools sat beside a batch of homemade vanilla extract. Everything perfectly organized, as it always had been before Theo crashed back into her life, with his smug smiles and too close whispers and almost kisses that definitely weren't supposed to haunt her dreams. Focus, Lin, she muttered to herself. Win first, freak out later. When she entered the community center, Josie froze in the doorway. The usually plain space had transformed into something straight out of a Food Network special. Banners hung from the ceiling, emblazoned with Maplewood's annual bake-off final showdown. A local news crew was setting up cameras near the judges' table, and the audience seating had been expanded to accommodate what looked like half the town. Despite the butterflies in her stomach, which were absolutely competition nerves, not Theo-related, Josie moved purposefully toward her assigned station. Their station. The one they'd have to share for the next 3 hours, while everyone in town watched their every move. Great. She began unpacking her tools, neatly arranging measuring cups by size. Her hands betrayed her with a slight tremble, as she placed her favorite whisk on the countertop. Well, well, well. If it isn't Maplewood's most fascinating competitor. Josie looked up to find Margot DuPont leaning against the counter, tape recorder already in hand, her notepad flipped to a clean page. The reporter wore her signature red lipstick and an expression that suggested she knew something particularly juicy. I'm just setting up, Margot. The competition doesn't start for another 25 minutes. Oh, I know. Margot's smile widened. But the story started days ago, didn't it? So Josie, she continued, leaning closer and pressing the record button with an exaggerated click, sources say you and Theo had quite the private practice session during Tuesday's storm? Josie nearly dropped her favorite whisk, eyes widening. What? How did you? We were just what? Margot's eyebrows shot up expectantly. Baking. Josie hissed, though even to her own ears it sounded unconvincing. We were working on techniques for today. That's all. And that's why Mr. Carter saw you leaving Marchand's patisserie looking, and I quote, flushed, flustered, and suspiciously damp. It was raining. I got caught in the downpour. There was nothing. Josie stopped herself, realizing she was only feeding Margot's gossip machine. She took a deep breath. Don't you have other contestants to interview? None nearly as interesting. Margot clicked her pen with a wink. The whole town's been taking bets on you two, you know. Po May's Mahjong group has an entire bracket system. They what? Josie started, before her eyes landed on the front row of audience seating. There sat Po May and Gigi Marchand, heads bent together over a program, whispering animatedly. As if sensing her gaze, both grandmothers looked up simultaneously, and waved with such coordinated cheeriness that Josie narrowed her eyes in suspicion. Po adjusted her jade bracelet innocently, while Gigi gave a delicate little finger wave. The matching smug expressions on their faces confirmed every suspicion Josie had harbored for the past month. They hadn't just arranged this partnership, They'd orchestrated the entire situation like conductors with a well-rehearsed orchestra. Josie was about to march over and confront them when the community center doors swung open. A current of whispers rippled through the growing audience as Theo walked in, a leather toolbox tucked under one arm. Unlike his usual confident swagger, the one that made her want to both roll her eyes and watch him a second too long, there was something hesitant in his approach today. "I should go get some pre-show commentary from our other star baker," Margot said, straightening up with a conspiratorial smile. "Good luck, Josie. Try not to get too heated in the kitchen." Before Josie could retort, Margot had sauntered off, leaving her alone at the station as Theo approached. The memory of raindrops on his eyelashes, his fingers touching her cheek, the impossible closeness of his lips to hers, it all came rushing back with every step he took toward her. He set his toolbox down beside hers, running a hand through his already mussed hair. "Hey." "Hi," she managed, suddenly very interested in arranging her already perfectly arranged measuring cups. "About what happened or didn't happen at my bakery," Theo began, his voice lower than usual. Panic flared in Josie's chest. She couldn't do this here. Not with the entire town watching, not with cameras rolling, not with her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Let's just focus on winning, okay?" she interrupted with forced brightness, gesturing at their workstation. "I've organized everything by function and size. Your side is still cluttered, obviously, but I'll manage." An emotion she couldn't quite name flickered across his face before his signature crooked smile returned. "You love my clutter, Lin. Admit it. I tolerate your existence. Don't push your luck." He chuckled, the sound warm enough to make her stomach flip. Before either could say more, the head judge approached the central microphone, tapping it twice. "Welcome everyone, to the finals of the 43rd Annual Maplewood Bake-Off." Applause thundered through the room. "We have 6 extraordinary teams competing today, but only one will take home the coveted Golden Whisk Trophy and bragging rights for the year." Josie's pulse quickened. That trophy should have been all hers this year. "For our final challenge," the judge continued, "each team must create a signature dessert that tells their story as bakers. You'll have 3 hours to complete your masterpiece. On your mark, get set. Bake." The community center erupted in cheers as competitors rushed to their stations. Josie turned to Theo, already mentally flipping through possibilities. "We need something that showcases technical skill," she said, pulling out her notebook. "Maybe a complex layered entremet or a deconstructed." "What if," Theo interrupted, stepping closer than strictly necessary, his voice low for only her to hear, "we combine your precision with my improvisation? Something that represents both of us?" She looked up, ready to dismiss the idea as too simple, but the sincerity in his eyes caught her off guard. There was no trace of the teasing Theo who drove her crazy. This was the Theo she remembered from childhood, the one with earnest eyes who'd gasped in genuine awe when she'd mastered her first perfect macaron. "Like what?" she asked, hating how breathless she sounded. "A mille-feuille," he suggested. "But not traditional. Your layered techniques with my flavor combinations. Your precision with my flair." For a moment Josie could visualize it, his flaky buttery pastry paired with her complex cream fillings. Something that shouldn't work but somehow would. "Fine," she agreed, ignoring the tiny flutter in her chest. "But I'm measuring the ingredients." "Wouldn't dream of stopping you, Lin." They moved into action, working with surprising synchronicity. Theo handled the laminated dough, his fingers quick and confident as he folded butter into layers. Josie prepared a complex filling that balanced tartness with sweetness, a blend of lemon curd, mascarpone, and fresh berries. What surprised her most wasn't how well they worked together, but how natural it felt. Theo seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them, sliding ingredients within her reach just as she was about to ask for them. She found herself doing the same, handing him the rolling pin seconds before he reached for it, adjusting the oven temperature when she noticed him eyeing the controls. An hour into their work, Josie caught herself smiling as Theo whispered a steady stream of ridiculous pastry puns under his breath. When had this happened? This easy rhythm that made them move like dancers sharing the same music? "Can you grab the," she started. Vanilla? Already measured, he replied, sliding it toward her. And the fresh berries are washed and waiting. She narrowed her eyes. Stop doing that. What? Being incredibly efficient and devastatingly charming? He grinned. Reading my mind. It's unsettling. His laugh was soft. Maybe I just know you better than you think, Lin. Before she could process that statement, Josie noticed him reaching into his toolbox for a small amber bottle she didn't recognize. What is that? She asked, alarm creeping into her voice. That wasn't in the recipe we discussed. Instead of the defensive reaction she expected, Theo's expression softened. It's a special rose extract I developed at culinary school. He held it out to her. Smell it. Cautiously, she accepted the bottle, removing the dropper cap and taking a delicate sniff. The fragrance transported her instantly. Summer afternoons in Po's garden, the rose-infused cookies they'd made together as kids, the time she'd shown Theo how to extract flower essences. You remember, she said softly, not quite a question. Of course I do. His voice had dropped to match hers. I was trying to recreate those rose cookies you made when we were 15. Never got them quite right though. The thought of Theo in Paris, experimenting with rose extracts while thinking of their shared childhood, left Josie momentarily speechless. She handed the bottle back, fingers brushing his. Let's use it, she decided. But just a few drops. His smile was smaller than usual, but somehow more real. As you wish. They continued working, the rose extract adding a subtle floral note that complemented the berry filling perfectly. Their creation was taking shape, 3 layers of delicate puff pastry interspersed with fillings that showcased both their signature styles. The top layer would be adorned with a pattern of glazed berries and edible gold leaf, Theo's insistence naturally. With 30 minutes remaining, they were nearly finished. Josie stepped back to admire their work, a tentative pride blooming in her chest. Maybe this partnership hadn't been such a disaster, after all. I need to grab our final component from the refrigerator, she said. Can you start on the glaze? Theo nodded, already reaching for the powdered sugar. Josie hurried to the communal refrigerator, where they'd stored their berry reduction. As she retrieved the container, she heard a clatter from their workstation. She spun around to see Theo standing frozen, their carefully crafted sauce spilled across the counter, dripping onto the floor in a vibrant purple stream. Panic surging through her veins, Josie rushed back to their station. What happened? She demanded, setting down the reduction harder than intended. But instead of the frantic apologies she expected, Theo seemed oddly calm. He was already grabbing paper towels to contain the spill, while simultaneously reaching for the remaining components. We can salvage this, he said, his voice steady as he began modifying what remained. We'll need to adapt the design, but we have enough filling to. Josie stared at him, a terrible thought forming. He didn't seem surprised or particularly upset by the accident. In fact, he seemed prepared. Like he'd already been formulating a backup plan. Did you do that on purpose? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Theo's hand stilled. What? I said, did you do that on purpose? The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Is anything, ever serious to you? The hurt that flashed across his face was so raw, so genuine, that Josie immediately regretted her accusation. Theo had always deflected with jokes, always maintained that careless exterior, but this was different. She'd struck something real. You think I don't take this seriously? He asked quietly, tension radiating from every line of his body. The bustling competition hall suddenly felt empty, the noise fading to background static as he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Josie, I came back to Maplewood for you. I opened my bakery across from yours because I wanted to see you every day. I've been taking us seriously for years, you're the one who won't admit what's happening here. The timer buzzed, signaling the end of the competition. Around them, contestants raised their hands in victory or defeat. The audience burst into applause, but Josie stood frozen, Theo's words echoing in her ears. He'd come back for her. He'd stayed for her. All those smirks and teases and competitions, they hadn't been about rivalry at all. Before she could find her voice, the judges approached their station, cameras following in their wake. Theo held her gaze for one more moment, a question hanging in the air between them, before turning to present their creation, his showman's smile sliding back into place as if nothing had happened. Josie stood beside him, flower-dusted and breathless, a single thought crystallizing with terrifying clarity. Maybe, just maybe, she'd been fighting the wrong battle all along.
Chapter 6 Love Like Pastry Can't Be Rushed. Theo stood beside Josie at their station, heart hammering as the judges deliberated. The community center buzzed with anticipation, chairs creaking as spectators leaned forward, but Theo focused only on Josie's profile, the flower smudge on her temple, her teeth worrying her bottom lip, the way her fingers unconsciously tapped against her thigh when she was nervous. He'd seen that same nervous tick 1,000 times over the years, during their first junior baking competition when they were 12, during their high school finals, and again when she'd opened Sweet Haven. Some things never changed. "Would you stop staring?" Josie hissed without looking at him. "Can't help it," he murmured. "You've got flour?" "I know I have flour everywhere. It's a baking competition." Theo fought a smile. "I wasn't going to say everywhere." The conversation died as the head judge approached the microphone with dramatic flair. Judge Hoffman, a retired pastry chef from the city with an unfortunate penchant for bow ties, cleared his throat 3 times before tapping the mic. Theo instinctively reached for Josie's hand and was surprised when she didn't pull away. Her palm felt small against his, slightly sticky with sugar residue and trembling just enough for him to notice. "And the winners of this year's Maplewood Bake-Off," Judge Hoffman announced, pausing for effect as the entire room held its breath, "by a margin of just 2 points, are Josie Lin and Theo Marchand with their rivals' reunion pastry." The crowd erupted into cheers. Theo spotted Popo, May and Gigi high-fiving in the front row, not even pretending this wasn't their plan all along. Popo May discreetly tucked a small notebook into her purse, while Gigi adjusted her elaborate feathered hat with undisguised glee. Beside them, Margot DuPont frantically scribbled notes, the headline "Rivals to Champions" already visible on her notepad. But it was Josie's reaction that captivated him completely. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment as genuine surprise and joy transformed her face. Her wide-eyed delight reminded him of the 16-year-old girl who'd once danced around her grandmother's kitchen after perfecting her first soufflé, back when they'd been friends instead of rivals. Back before he'd left. "We won," she breathed, sounding genuinely shocked. "Was there ever any doubt?" Theo whispered back, squeezing her hand. She shot him a look. "Literally all the doubt, Marchand. You nearly set the oven on fire during practice." "Creative flair," he countered with a grin. As they stepped forward to accept their trophy, a gaudy gold-plated whisk mounted on marble, Josie slipped into competitive mode, graciously thanking everyone while subtly emphasizing her contributions to their winning creation. "We're so honored," she told Judge Hoffman, her voice carrying across the room. "This pastry combined my specialty in delicate cream work with Theo's unconventional approach to caramelization." Theo watched her with amusement and growing determination. She was doing that thing again, the polite professional distance, the careful relegation of whatever existed between them to the neat box labeled competition. Her attempt to re-establish boundaries only strengthened his resolve. Two could play that game. "Josie's being modest," he interjected smoothly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Her precision saved us when my adventurous spirit nearly went too far with the sugar work." He winked at the judge. "As usual, she keeps me in line." Josie's smile stayed fixed, but he felt her stiffen under his touch. Judge Hoffman beamed at them both, apparently oblivious to the tension. "This is exactly what the Maplewood Bake-Off represents," the judge declared, gesturing expansively. "Different styles coming together to create something greater than the sum of their parts." A flash went off as Margot snapped a photo for the Gazette. "Can we get a shot of you two holding the trophy together?" she called out, eyes gleaming with barely contained excitement. Theo grabbed the trophy with his left hand while keeping his right arm firmly around Josie's shoulders. Josie reached up to hold the other side, her smile professional, but her eyes darting toward him with a look that promised retribution. The flash went off again. "Perfect!" Margot exclaimed. "Now how about one where you're looking at each other instead of the camera?" Josie began. "Great idea," Theo interrupted, turning to face Josie with his most infuriating smile. "Come on, Lin. One for the fans. Josie turned to face him, and for a split second her professional mask slipped again, just enough for Theo to catch a glimpse of vulnerability behind her irritation. Their eyes met, and the playfulness in his expression softened into something more genuine. The camera flash caught them in that unguarded moment. "That's going on the front page," Margot muttered gleefully, reviewing the shot. During the flurry of congratulations, cameras, and handshakes that followed, Theo noticed Josie gradually edging toward the prep station, clearly planning her escape. He excused himself from a conversation with the mayor and followed her, cutting off her retreat path with practiced ease. Cornering her by the prep station, Theo leaned against the counter, deliberately blocking her exit. "You know," he said conversationally, "for someone who just won the biggest baking competition in town, you look ready to bolt." Josie busied herself with needlessly reorganizing utensils, avoiding his eyes. "I'm not bolting. I'm cleaning up. Some of us care about leaving a tidy workspace." "Right," Theo nodded, watching as she aligned spatulas that were already perfectly straight. "That's why you've rearranged those measuring spoons 4 times. She shot him an annoyed glance. "Don't you have some fans to charm? I saw Mrs. Peterson looking for you earlier. Something about wanting your secret croissant recipe." "Already gave her the sanitized version," Theo said with a shrug. "The one that won't work without my touch." "Your touch," Josie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You mean randomly adjusting measurements based on your mood that day?" "I call it intuition," he corrected. "Not that you'd understand with your militaristic approach to tablespoons." "Precision," she corrected primly, "is what makes baking a science rather than a guessing game." "And artistry," he countered, stepping closer, "is what makes it worth eating." A familiar rhythm, this back and forth. Safe territory. Except nothing felt safe anymore, not since the almost kiss at his bakery, and definitely not since he'd blurted out his feelings in the middle of the competition. Josie attempted to brush past him with a casual, "We should go thank the judges again," but Theo gently caught her wrist. The touch stopped her mid-sentence. Her pulse fluttered wildly beneath his fingers. "Josie," he said, his voice dropping to that serious tone he rarely used. "About what I said earlier." "It's fine," she interrupted, words tumbling out too quickly. "Heat of competition, high emotions, I get it. We make a good team, and that's all that matters, right?" Her forced smile didn't reach her eyes as she brushed imaginary flour from her already clean apron. Theo studied her for a moment, saw the faint tremble in her hands despite her confident stance. He recognized this defense mechanism, the way she retreated behind professionalism when emotions got too real. She'd done the same thing at 16 when he'd complimented her perfect soufflé, and her eyes had lit up with something more than competitive pride. He stepped closer, deliberately invading her space. "Tell me you don't feel it," he challenged softly. "I dare you." Her eyes widened as he echoed the exact phrase she'd used when they were 16, daring him to admit her chocolate soufflé was better than his. She'd stood just like this then too, chin tilted up in defiance, eyes bright with something beyond simple competition. "That's not fair," she whispered. "I never claimed to play fair, Lin." Josie opened her mouth, closed it, then stammered, It's just the excitement of winning. That's all this is." Even she didn't sound convinced. Theo's lips curved into a slow smile as he reached up to brush flour from her cheek, his thumb lingering against the softness of her skin. "Is it? Because I think you've been using this rivalry as an excuse for years." "Same as me." Her breath caught. "An excuse for what?" "For not admitting what's really going on here." He gestured between them. "This thing that's been simmering since we were kids." "We were friends," she protested weakly. "We were never just friends, Josie." She swallowed hard. "You left. I came back. 7 years later. And picked a storefront directly across from yours," he pointed out. "Do you really think that was a coincidence?" A flash of surprise crossed her face. "You chose that location deliberately? But you acted like I didn't care. Like it was just convenient?" Theo shook his head. "Come on, Lin. You know me better than that. I don't do anything without a reason." "So opening a competing bakery was what, your way of flirting?" "Work, didn't it?" he smirked. "Got your attention." She made an exasperated sound. "You are the most..." "Lin," he said with surprising tenderness, For once in your life, stop competing and just admit I'm right." Before she could argue, Theo cupped her face between his hands and kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, giving her every chance to pull away, but when she made a small sound and leaned in instead, it deepened into something that made the noisy room around them disappear completely. Her lips were soft beneath his, tasting faintly of the raspberry compote they'd used in their winning pastry. Theo slid one hand to the small of her back, pulling her closer, as 7 years of tension melted into something sweeter than any dessert he'd ever created. Josie's fingers tangled in his hair, and he felt rather than heard her sigh against his mouth. This was what he'd come back to Maplewood for. Not to win some small-town competition, but to find his way back to her. They broke apart to whistles and applause. Apparently their moment wasn't as private as it felt. Popo May was collecting money from Gigi, who laughed and said something in French about stubborn grandchildren. Eli slow clapped sarcastically from across the room. Theo's ears burned, but he couldn't bring himself to care about the audience. Not when Josie was looking up at him with that mixture of exasperation and wonder, her cheeks flushed pink. "Everyone's staring," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. "Let them," he murmured. "I've been wanting to do that since I came back to town." "You're going to be so smugly unbearable about this," she said, but her arms were looping around his neck, pulling him closer. Theo grinned against her mouth. "For once we both win," he whispered before kissing her again, tasting sugar and victory, and the sweetness of finally getting something more valuable than any trophy. When they broke apart, he kept his forehead pressed against hers, unwilling to let too much space come between them. For once, Josie seemed equally reluctant to pull away. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this doesn't mean you're the better baker." Theo burst out laughing. "Seriously? That's where your mind goes right now?" "I'm just saying." Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "The judges said we won by our combined talents. Not because your techniques are better than mine." "Josephine Lin," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "I just poured my heart out, kissed you senseless in front of the entire town, and you're still keeping score?" "Always," she said with a small smile. Then more softly, "But maybe we could practice combining our skills more often." "Practice makes perfect," he agreed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Though I might need to practice that kiss a few more times to get it right." A throat cleared beside them, and they turned to find Popo May and Gigi standing there, looking impossibly smug. "So sorry to interrupt," Gigi said in French-accented English that didn't sound sorry at all, "but we wanted to congratulate our grandchildren on their victory." "Yes, you both showed excellent teamwork," Popo May added with exaggerated innocence. "Such harmony. As if you were made to work together." Theo exchanged a look with Josie. "You two planned this whole thing, didn't you? The partner assignment, the competition theme." "I have no idea what you mean," Popo May said, patting her carefully styled hair. "The competition pairings are done by random draw." "A very fair, completely unbiased selection process," Gigi agreed, adjusting her hat. "Which you just happen to oversee as committee members," Josie said flatly. "Such suspicious minds," Popo May clicked her tongue. "But if you must know, we simply encouraged fate in the right direction." "Like good grandmothers should," Gigi added with a wink. Theo laughed, unable to muster any real annoyance. "Well, your meddling worked, I guess. Happy now?" "Ecstatic," Popo May replied, beaming. "Though I did think it would take at least another month," Gigi confessed. "You are both so stubborn." "Which is why I won our bet," Popo May said smugly. "I know my granddaughter. Once she decides something, even stubbornness can't stand in her way." Josie groaned. "You were betting on us? Seriously?" "The entire town was betting on you, Cherie," Gigi patted Josie's cheek. "We merely had the advantage of intimate knowledge." "And strategic intervention," Popo May added. As the grandmothers moved away, clearly pleased with themselves, Theo turned back to Josie. "So," he said, taking her hand. "What happens now?" "Well," she replied, glancing at their entwined fingers, "I still think your croissants are overrated. And I still think you measure vanilla with unnecessary precision. But," she continued with a small smile, "I might be willing to conduct some comparative research. Professional curiosity." "Professional curiosity," he repeated, unable to stop grinning. "Of course. Maybe we could start with breakfast. Tomorrow. At your place." "My place has better coffee," he agreed. And my place has better pastries, she shot back instantly. Theo laughed, pulling her closer. Some things would never change, and he wouldn't want them to. How about I bring the coffee, you bring the pastries, and we'll see who's right. Deal, Josie said, stretching up to kiss him again. But I'm still going to win. Keep telling yourself that, Lin, he mumbled against her lips. But for the first time in their long history of competition, Theo didn't care who came out ahead, because they had finally figured out they were on the same team. Epilogue, a recipe for forever. Theo slipped the key into the lock of Sweet Haven Bakery, the metal still unfamiliar between his fingers despite having received it 3 weeks ago. Josie had pressed it into his palm with exaggerated seriousness. Her eyes narrowed as she declared it was for emergencies only. They both knew that was a lie. The door opened with a soft click, and Theo stepped into the darkened bakery, the scent of sugar, vanilla, and lingering hints of yesterday's pastries welcoming him like an old friend. He flipped on only the kitchen lights, leaving the front of the shop in gentle shadows. There was something about being here in these quiet pre-dawn hours that felt almost sacred, a secret moment before the world woke up. He moved through the space with practiced confidence now, no longer feeling like an intruder in Josie's territory. 3 months since their dramatic kiss at the bake-off had transformed him from rival to whatever he was now. Partner seemed too formal. Boyfriend too juvenile for what they shared. Co-conspirator in kitchen crimes, perhaps. Theo ran his fingers along the smooth marble countertop as he made his way to the espresso machine, the gleaming Italian model he had accidentally had delivered here instead of to his own patisserie. Josie had rolled her eyes when it arrived, muttering about presumptuous French bakers, but he'd caught her admiring it when she thought he wasn't looking. "Good morning, beautiful," he whispered to the machine, patting it affectionately before beginning the ritual of preparing the perfect espresso. While the machine warmed up, Theo took in the subtle changes around the kitchen, changes that spoke volumes about how their lives had intertwined. His pastry tools now occupied a designated drawer next to Josie's, his copper measuring cups nestled beside her precision digital scales. His leather-bound recipe notebook, filled with hastily scribbled measurements and coffee stains, rested beside her meticulously organized binder with color-coded tabs and plastic sheet protectors. Near the register sat a framed photo of them holding their bake-off trophy, Josie mid-laugh as Theo pressed a flour-dusted kiss to her cheek. His grandmother had snapped the picture, looking smug as if she'd personally arranged the lighting to highlight her matchmaking success. The espresso machine hissed, pulling Theo from his thoughts. He moved with fluid efficiency, grinding the beans to the perfect consistency and tamping them down with practiced pressure. Step 1 complete, he murmured to himself, moving to the proofing drawer where he'd stashed the croissants the night before. He'd been experimenting with a new technique, incorporating a hint of honey into the laminated dough. It was the kind of improvisation that used to drive Josie to distraction, but now she merely pretended to be annoyed, secretly keeping notes when she thought he wasn't paying attention. As he slid the tray of perfectly proofed crescents into the preheated oven, Theo felt a twinge of satisfaction. These would be exceptional, even by his standards. The first rays of sunrise began filtering through the windows, painting the empty cobblestone street outside in shades of gold and amber. Theo leaned against the counter, cradling his espresso cup as he watched the world slowly wake up. There was something magical about this liminal space between night and day, when possibilities seemed endless and the air itself felt charged with potential. The soft chime of the bell above the door broke his reverie. Josie shuffled in, hair tousled and eyes still heavy with sleep. She was drowning in his navy blue hoodie, the sleeves rolled up several times to free her hands. She hadn't bothered with makeup, and a faint pillow crease marked her cheek. Theo felt his heart constrict at the sight. Without a word, Josie made a beeline for him, or more accurately, for the espresso in his hand. She reached up and plucked the cup from his fingers, bringing it directly to her lips and taking a long, appreciative sip. "Thief," Theo accused affectionately, pulling her against his side with one arm. She mumbled something completely unintelligible into his shoulder, the vibration of her voice seeping through his thin shirt. He caught maybe 2 words, early and possibly murder. "What was that?" "I don't speak pre-caffeine, Josie," he teased, kissing the top of her head. She took another substantial sip before raising her face to his. Her eyes, though still sleepy, held that familiar spark that never failed to make his breath catch. She stretched up on her tiptoes to press a kiss to his jaw, a sleepy gesture of affection that felt more intimate than their most passionate embraces. I said, she clarified, voice still delightfully raspy with sleep, it's criminally early and you're criminally cheerful about it. Funny how you never complain about my early hours when there are freshly baked goods involved, he countered, glancing meaningfully at the oven where his croissants were already filling the space with a buttery, honeyed aroma. Josie inhaled deeply, closing her eyes in appreciation. I'd say it's a fair trade. My kitchen for your baking. Is that what we're calling it now? A trade? He asked, guiding her toward a stool at the prep counter. And here I thought it was because you couldn't bear to be away from me. She snorted, settling onto the stool and stealing another sip of his espresso. I couldn't bear to be away from your croissants. There's a difference. Of course, Theo nodded seriously. My mistake. He moved around the kitchen with practiced ease now, retrieving another cup for his own espresso since Josie had clearly claimed his original one. These mornings had become something of a ritual, him arriving first to start the day's baking, Josie appearing just as the first batch went into the oven, always stealing his first cup of coffee. It was a dance they'd perfected without ever discussing the steps. Josie perched on her stool, chin resting on her palm as she watched him work. Her eyes tracked his movements with a blend of professional assessment and something warmer, more personal. It still gave him a thrill, being watched like that, no longer as a competitor but as someone worthy of her attention. We should rename the bakery, she suggested suddenly, her voice still carrying that delicious morning roughness. Sweet Haven is fine, but Josie's the best and Theo's just okay, has a nice ring to it. Theo laughed, leaning across the counter toward her. I'll consider it, if you admit my croissants are better than yours. He reached out to tuck a wayward strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering longer than necessary just because he could now. Never, she declared, but leaned into his touch nonetheless, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. I'll take my secrets to the grave. You already stole my signature move, he pointed out. Using honey in the dough. I saw you testing it last week. Her eyes flew open. I was not. I was just investigating competitive techniques. Is that what we're calling corporate espionage these days? It's not espionage if you leave your notebook open on the counter, she countered, eyes sparkling with mischief. You, Theo began, but was interrupted by the dramatic swing of the front door. Popo, May and Gigi marched in with matching determined expressions, their arms laden with bags of produce and suspicious-looking packages. Theo immediately recognized the calculating gleam in his grandmother's eye, the same look she'd worn when orchestrating his partnership with Josie for the bake-off. Bonjour, mes chéris. Gigi called out cheerfully, her accent more pronounced than usual, which Theo knew meant she was up to something. Are we interrupting something? Not yet, Theo muttered just loud enough for Josie to hear, earning him a swift elbow to the ribs. He grinned unrepentantly, pulling the perfectly golden croissants from the oven as the grandmothers bustled in, immediately taking command of the space like they owned it. It smells divine in here, Gigi commented, setting down her bags with a flourish. Theodore, you've added honey to the dough, yes? Very clever. How did you? Theo began, then shook his head. Never mind. His grandmother had always possessed an uncanny ability to identify ingredients by smell alone, a skill she claimed was simply being French. Popo May placed a hand over her heart, looking between Josie and Theo with exaggerated emotion. Ah, how lovely it is to see young love blooming like a fresh batch of steamed buns. Her tone was so theatrical that Theo immediately became suspicious, exchanging a glance with Josie who seemed equally wary. What are you both doing here so early? Josie asked, sliding off her stool to inspect the bags they brought. And what's all this? Just a few ingredients for a special project, Popo May answered vaguely, moving some of the bags out of Josie's reach. Nothing for you to worry about. When you say nothing to worry about, that's precisely when I start worrying, Josie muttered. The back door swung open before either grandmother could elaborate, and Eli entered with arms full of fresh flowers for the display case. His hair was still damp from a shower, cheeks pink from the morning chill. Morning, lovebirds, he called out cheerfully before noticing the grandmothers. His steps faltered slightly. Oh, hello, Mrs. Lin, Mrs. Marchand. Those are some interesting ingredients you've brought. Theo watched with growing alarm as both grandmothers turned toward Eli with identical calculating expressions. It was the same look they'd worn 6 months ago when plotting to throw him and Josie together. He recognized the signs, the slight tilt of his grandmother's head, the too casual way Po-Po-May adjusted her glasses. Elijah! Po-Po-May exclaimed with too much enthusiasm. Just the person we wanted to see. I am? Eli asked, wariness creeping into his voice as he set down the flowers. Indeed, Po-Po-May continued, smoothing her already immaculate cardigan. Gigi's grandniece is visiting next week, such a lovely girl, very talented with flower arrangements. She's also single, Gigi added pointedly, and loves bread. The grandmothers exchanged a meaningful look that Theo recognized all too well. He nearly choked on his freshly made espresso, catching Josie's eye with raised eyebrows that clearly communicated, "Oh no, they have a new target." "That's nice," Eli responded, clearly confused by the sudden interest in his dating life. "I'm sure she's great." "Oh, she's wonderful," Gigi gushed, placing a hand dramatically on Eli's forearm. "And you know, she mentioned she would love to see an authentic American bakery while she's here. Perhaps you could show her around," Po-Po-May suggested innocently. "You're so knowledgeable about the business side of things." As Eli remained oblivious to the matchmaking scheme unfolding around him, Josie pressed her lips together, clearly trying not to laugh. She shuffled over to Theo's side, burying her face against his shoulder to muffle her giggles. "Yeah, of course," Eli said with genuine politeness. "I'd be happy to show her around." "Excellent." Gigi clapped her hands together. "She arrives Tuesday evening. I told her all about your wonderful free sample jar for imperfect bakes. Such a charitable idea." Theo wrapped an arm around Josie's shoulders, pulling her closer as they watched the trap close around an unsuspecting Eli. He bent to whisper in her ear, "Should we warn him?" Josie tilted her face up, mischief dancing in her eyes. "And miss the show? Not a chance." "I feel a little guilty," Theo admitted, though he made no move to intervene. "You didn't feel guilty when they were doing it to us," she pointed out. "True, but we were obviously perfect for each other," he replied with a smirk. "Poor Eli doesn't stand a chance." "Marriott is very excited to meet you," Gigi was telling Eli, who was now looking slightly overwhelmed as both grandmothers circled him like elegant sharks. "She's my brother's granddaughter, you know. Very artistic. Makes the most beautiful bread sculptures." "Bread sculptures?" Eli repeated weakly. "Oh yes," Po-Po-May nodded seriously. "Gigi showed me pictures. Very impressive talent." Josie stifled another laugh against Theo's chest. "This is cruel," she whispered. "We should help him." "In a minute," Theo said, enjoying the familiar comfort of Josie pressed against him while their grandmothers terrorized someone else for a change. "Let him suffer a bit longer." Po-Po-May had somehow maneuvered Eli into a corner, showing him something on her phone, presumably photos of Gigi's mysterious grandniece, while Gigi unpacked various exotic-looking ingredients onto the counter. "What are you two really doing here?" Theo asked his grandmother, curiosity finally getting the better of him. "Besides traumatizing Eli." Gigi waved her hand dismissively. "Just a little project May and I are working on. Nothing for you young people to worry about." "The last time you said that you rigged a town-wide baking competition," Josie reminded them. "And look how well that turned out," Po-Po-May replied without a hint of remorse, gesturing between Theo and Josie. "You should be thanking us." Theo felt Josie tense slightly in his arms, and he knew she was gearing up for one of her stubborn retorts. He squeezed her shoulder gently, a silent reminder that getting drawn into an argument with their grandmothers was like trying to outswim a riptide. "We're very grateful," Theo said diplomatically, ignoring Josie's quiet snort of disbelief. "But maybe Eli doesn't need the same intervention." "Everyone needs a little help sometimes," Gigi said airily, pulling what looked suspiciously like 10 pounds of red bean paste from one of her bags. "Now, are you going to share those croissants, or are you saving them all for Josephine?" As Theo moved to plate the still warm pastries, he caught Josie's eye across the kitchen. She was shaking her head in exasperated fondness at their grandmother's antics, but there was a softness in her expression that made his heart skip. It was the same look she'd given him that morning after the bake-off, when she'd shown up at his door with pastries and a grudging admission that maybe, just maybe, his coffee was better than hers. He winked at her, silently communicating what they both knew. As meddlesome as their grandmothers were, neither of them could truly complain about the results. "Eli," Josie finally called, taking pity on her friend who was now being shown what appeared to be an entire photo album on Po May's phone. "I need your help with the display case setup." "Coming," Eli replied with palpable relief, practically diving away from the grandmothers. As their grandmothers turned their attention to the croissants, still whispering conspiratorially, Theo slid an arm around Josie's waist and pulled her close enough to murmur, "Want to place bets on how long before they have Eli engaged to this mystery niece?" Josie leaned into him, her voice pitched low. 2 months. 3 tops. "I say 6 weeks, Theo countered, brushing his lips against her temple. "Loser makes breakfast in bed for a week?" "Deal," she agreed, tilting her face up to his with a competitive gleam in her eye that still, after all this time, made his pulse quicken. "But I hope you know I'm going to win." "You always do," he admitted fondly, stealing a quick kiss before the grandmothers could notice and start planning their wedding. Again.
Sweet Haven Bakery was bathed in soft ambient lighting, as Josie methodically wiped down the last stainless steel counter. The kitchen was immaculate, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day's baking, and smelled of cinnamon butter and the lingering warmth of the ovens. She hummed softly to herself, believing she was alone. Her fingertips traced the smooth, cool surface of the counter, a small smile playing on her lips. This was her favorite time in the bakery, after the storm of customers and baking had passed, when everything was in perfect order again. It felt like the kitchen was exhaling after a long day, and she could finally breathe with it. Josie turned to hang up her cleaning cloth, and startled at the sight of Theo still perched on the prep table, legs dangling, watching her with undisguised affection. He'd rolled up his sleeves, revealing flour-dusted forearms, and his hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it all day. Her heart did that stupid little flip it had started doing whenever he looked at her like that, like she was some rare, perfect pastry he couldn't quite believe existed. "You're staring," Josie pointed out, crossing her arms defensively even as her lips twitched upward. She hated how easily he could make her stomach flutter these days, just by existing in her space. It was completely unfair. Theo didn't deny it, just smirked and replied, "You're beautiful," with such uncharacteristic sincerity that Josie momentarily lost her witty comeback. Heat rushed to her cheeks. They'd been officially together for 3 weeks now, and she still wasn't used to the way he could shift from infuriating competitor to disarmingly sweet boyfriend in the span of a heartbeat. It felt like emotional whiplash in the best possible way. Josie recovered quickly, rolling her eyes to mask how the compliment affected her. "Wow. Smooth," she deflected, busying herself with adjusting the already perfect row of mixing bowls. The metal clanged softly, as she nudged one a millimeter to the right. Theo laughed softly but didn't back down. "I mean it," he said, his voice lacking its usual teasing edge. "You know flattery won't get you the secret ingredient in my lemon tarts," she replied, trying to regain her footing in their usual banter. "I already know the secret ingredient." Her head snapped up. "You do not." "Orange blossom honey." His dimples deepened with his grin. "Am I right?" Josie's jaw dropped. "How did you?" She narrowed her eyes. "Eli told you, didn't he? That traitor." "Actually," Theo slid off the counter and took a step toward her, "I tasted it. I pay attention to details, Lin. Especially when it comes to you." The moment hung between them, charged and expectant, until a distinct sound of suppressed giggling came from the darkened front of the bakery. Josie froze mid-movement, recognition dawning on her face. That particular pitch of barely contained delight was unmistakable. She'd heard it at every embarrassing moment of her life. Her stomach dropped as she whirled around toward the noise. "Po? Gigi." Like a perfectly choreographed comedy duo, Po May and Gigi emerged from behind the pastry display case, looking not the least bit embarrassed at being caught. They stepped into the kitchen light, Po straightening her cardigan while Gigi adjusted her elaborate scarf with dignified innocence. "Oh, don't mind us. We were just locking up," Po May explained with exaggerated casualness, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Josie narrowed her eyes suspiciously at their two innocent expressions. "The bakery has an automatic lock," she pointed out dryly. Po shrugged, undeterred. "Still best to check. You young people so trusting of technology." She waved her hand dismissively, the jade bracelet on her wrist catching the light. Right. Josie crossed her arms. And I suppose you also needed to hide behind the display case to check the lock? The angle was better from there, Gigi chimed in helpfully, her French accent more pronounced than usual, something Josie had noticed happened whenever she was particularly pleased with herself. For security purposes. Josie groaned, dragging a hand down her face in exasperation. How long have you been standing there? She demanded. Gigi waved a dismissive hand, her numerous rings catching the light. Just long enough to know Theo should kiss you properly instead of talking, she declared with the authority of someone who's been married 3 times. Exactly, Popome nodded sagely. Too much talking, not enough kissing. In my day. Please don't finish that sentence, Josie begged, mortification washing over her in waves. Theo the traitor was watching the exchange with undisguised amusement, arms crossed over his chest and shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. What? Popome huffed. You think old people don't know about romance? Who do you think taught your mother about? Stop. Josie spluttered incoherently, cheeks flushing a deep crimson. We're changing the subject. Now. Theo, rather than sharing her mortification, merely pushed away from the prep table with a growing grin. You heard them, he said, taking a step toward her, eyes dancing with amusement and something much deeper. Don't you dare, Josie warned, taking a step backward and bumping into the counter. They don't need encouragement, Marchand. Mon petit cho, there's nothing wrong with a little encouragement, Gigi said, her tone making it clear she considered herself something of a romance expert. Young people today, always rushing. The kiss is an art form. Yes. Popo clapped her hands together. Like making perfect dumplings. You must have patience and proper technique. Josie wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. I cannot believe we're having this conversation. As Theo approached, Josie muttered about how impossibly insufferable he was, how this entire town was conspiring against her, and how grandmothers should absolutely not be allowed to meddle this effectively. Her complaints trailed off when Theo cupped her face in his hands, thumbs gently brushing her cheeks. I hate you, she whispered, but her hands were already reaching for him, fingers curling into the front of his shirt. No you don't, he murmured, his voice low and warm. I hate that you're enjoying this. His dimple appeared. Liar. The kiss was slow and lingering, the kind that belonged in the final scene of a romantic movie. Josie's indignation melted away as her hands found their way to his shoulders, forgetting for a moment that they had an audience until she heard actual applause from the grandmothers. Bravo. Gigi called out, clapping enthusiastically. Always knew you two would end up together, Popome said smugly, as if she'd personally orchestrated the entire universe to make this happen. Which, knowing her grandmother, Josie wouldn't entirely rule out. The perfect moment shattered when Eli walked in through the back door, carrying a tray of experimental breadsticks, and nearly dropped everything at the scene before him. Can you people get a room that isn't our kitchen? He complained, but there's no real annoyance in his voice. We have health codes, you know. Pretty sure, making out by the prep station violates at least 3 of them. Josie broke away from Theo, her face burning. It's not we weren't. Save it, Eli said, setting the tray down. I've watched you two orbit each other for years. The only surprise is that it took you this long. He glanced toward the grandmothers. Though I'm guessing these two had something to do with speeding things along. Before anyone could respond, Popome seized the opportunity with alarming swiftness. Eli, darling, have you met my friend Gigi's lovely granddaughter? She's single. Eli froze mid-step, horror dawning on his face as he realized he'd become the next target. Like a deer spotting an approaching predator, he slowly turned toward the grandmothers, eyes wide. What? No. Absolutely not. He backed away, holding up his hands. I'm busy. Very busy. With bread. And other things. Camille is a wonderful girl, Gigi continued as if he hadn't spoken. She's coming to visit next month. Very pretty. Makes excellent pain au chocolat. A baker. Popome nodded appreciatively. Perfect match. You already share interests. I never said I wanted to date another baker, Eli protested, looking desperately toward Josie for help. Josie, still wrapped in Theo's arms, was too busy enjoying the fact that the matchmaking spotlight had finally moved off her. I don't know, Eli. Camille sounds nice. Does she like sourdough? Traitor, Eli mouthed at her. Theo burst into laughter as Josie groaned, burying her face in his chest. We're never getting rid of them, are we? She mumbled against his shirt. Theo grinned, kissing her temple softly. Not a chance. His arms tightened around her, and despite her exasperation, Josie melted into him, savoring the warmth and solidity of his body against hers. Behind them, Po, May, and Gigi were already whispering about Eli, exchanging conspiratorial glances. And just like that, Maplewood's next love story was in the planning stages. I bet Camille won't even be remotely interested in me, Eli muttered, arranging his breadsticks with more force than necessary. Poor naive Eli. Josie shook her head. That's what I thought about Theo, and look where we are now. She glanced up at Theo, who was watching her with that soft expression that still made her heart skip. True, Theo agreed. I was completely under her spell from day one. Josie scoffed. Please. You spent years antagonizing me. It's called flirting, Lin. It's called being an insufferable pain in my language, dear, Po May interrupted without missing a beat in her conversation with Gigi. Eli groaned, grabbing a breadstick and biting into it aggressively. Great. Now I have this to look forward to. Thanks for nothing, you two. Don't worry, Josie patted his arm sympathetically. I'll help you escape. Theo raised an eyebrow. Will you? Because I seem to remember you throwing me directly into their path multiple times. That was different. How? You deserved it. For what? For being you, she replied sweetly, poking him in the chest. Ah, young love, Gigi sighed dreamily, watching them. So passionate. The best kind, Po May agreed. Like good kimchi, better with a little heat. Josie closed her eyes. Did my grandmother just compare our relationship to fermented cabbage? Fermented cabbage that gets spicier over time, Theo corrected, looking far too amused. Accurate, I'd say. Well, as fascinating as this conversation is, Eli said, edging toward the door, I should probably inventory the flour. In the storeroom. Far away from here. Wait, Eli. Gigi called. I have pictures of Delilah on my phone. Eli made a break for it, disappearing through the swinging door with impressive speed. Po May clicked her tongue. So shy, that boy. Must be why he's still single. We should go, Gigi announced, linking arms with Po May. Bridge night, at the community center. Ruth will be unbearable if we're late again. And we need to discuss strategy for Eli and Delilah, Po May added, not bothering to lower her voice. They made their way toward the front door, chattering excitedly about their matchmaking plans. Just before they left, Po May turned back, fixing Josie with a knowing look. Don't forget to lock up properly, Sunbeam, she said with a mischievous wink. And remember what I said about technique. Out. Josie pointed at the door, her face flaming. Both of you. The sound of their laughter lingered, even after the bell over the door jingled to signal their departure. Silence settled over the bakery, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of Eli banging around in the storeroom, likely hiding from any potential return of the grandmothers. Josie turned to Theo, who was watching her with that infuriating half-smile that used to drive her crazy. Now it just made her heart do complicated gymnastics in her chest. So, she said, trying to sound casual. About that technique. Theo's eyebrows shot up. Are you asking for my expertise, Lin? His voice dropped to that low, teasing tone that sent shivers down her spine. Because I'd be happy to demonstrate. Shut up, Marchand, she murmured, stepping closer until they were toe-to-toe. Make me. Josie rolled her eyes, but her lips were already curving into a smile as she reached up to loop her arms around his neck. You're impossible. Yet here you are, he pointed out, his hand settling on her waist, warm and steady. Here I am, she agreed softly. And as Theo lowered his head to capture her lips again, Josie silently admitted that maybe, just maybe, their grandmothers had been right all along. Not that she'd ever tell them that. They were insufferable enough already.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Also be on the lookout for more stories with these meddling matchmaking grandmothers. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review on Amazon.